We are really pleased this morning to have the opportunity to listen to Professor Provenza. He has a lot to say, and so he's going to talk really fast, as I understand it. And so I'm going to talk really fast too, and just introduce him quickly so that we can then get to the reason we're here. We're very pleased to have Fred here. Fred and his team have produced really groundbreaking research for what is now known as really behavior-based management of livestock, wildlife, and landscapes. And his work has continued to inspire research groups around the entire country. We're going to be excited to hear some of that. Just a couple of things about Fred. He's an emeritus professor in wildlife resources at Utah State University. He began his career working on a ranch near Salida, Colorado, while earning a bachelor's degree in wildlife biology from Colorado State University. He then came to Utah State University, where he earned both his master's and Ph.D. in range science, and then joined our faculty at Utah State University in 1982. He's received a long list of awards and recognitions over the course of his career: Outstanding Graduate Mentor, Professor of the Year in the College of Natural Resources in both 1989 and 2003. In 2008, Dr. Provenza earned USU's most prestigious research accolade, the Wynne Thorne Career Research Award. He has been author or co-author of over 225 publications in peer-reviewed journals and books, and a keynote speaker at numerous national and international meetings. Please join me in recognizing Professor Provenza.
Thank you, Stan, for the introduction, Kevin for the sponsorship. It's really a pleasure to be here with all of you today. I've rehearsed more for this talk than I have for actually any other. They leave nothing to chance, and they put you on a tight time schedule. So I'm going to try to summarize 30 years of work in 30 minutes here. So I will talk a little bit quickly, but hopefully I won't lose you. So what we've been about is trying to understand behavior, because behavior is what everything does. From microbes to humans, we all behave. And understanding how behavior works is critical then to understanding how to work within systems. The theme I'm going to start off with is what makes behavior so relevant. And that's the notion that the only constant in life is change. The world is constantly changing, and yet we typically regard change as anomalous, a kind of transitory disruption in a normally constant world. Even Albert Einstein was reluctant to accept change. When he introduced the cosmological constant into the general theory of relativity, what that amounted to was a refusal to accept change as the guiding principle structuring the evolution of the universe, and it was, as he later recounted, the greatest blunder of his career. On a more local scale, when droughts, tsunamis, hurricanes, floods strike, when great volcanoes like Mount St. Helens erupt, knocking down trees, covering the earth with a layer of volcanic ash for miles around, we think how strange it is that nature should misbehave so. It is, we tell ourselves, a momentary lapse, a kind of geological tantrum. Soon our old planet will regain its composure, its sameness. But the truth is, it's only our short tenure on Earth that deludes us. Our time here is too short to see continents crash together and tear apart, mountains rise and fall, vast deserts replace oceans, climates continually warming and cooling. Too short to see literally tens of thousands of plant and animal species coming and going like the ever-changing colors and shapes of a kaleidoscope. Change then isn't the exception to the rule, it's the only rule. Any individual, any social group, any species, if it's going to survive, has got to be able to cope with change. Our program has been about trying to understand how animals adapt to change, including people. And there are three facets of that I want to briefly touch on today. The first has to do with what I refer to as the wisdom of the body. It's the wisdom that's built into creatures at all levels of how to continually know what and what not to eat, what and what not to do. It's a body wisdom. So I'll begin with that. I'll then talk about the role of culture and social kind of organizations and why they're so important for adaptation as well. I'll end by talking about what I refer to as satiety. And satiety is so important because it continually encourages individuals and social groups to explore the bounds between the familiar and that's unfamiliar to them. It becomes a very important mechanism in adaptation. So to begin with this first topic, more than a matter of taste, the wisdom of the body. You're all enjoying breakfast. I was too nervous to eat. So anyway, if I were to ask you why you like the foods you like, what would you tell me?
Tastes good.
Because it tastes good, right? Why don't you like them? Odds are you tell me because it tastes bad, huh? And you'd be in good company because that's how it's defined in the dictionary. But our work has redefined what palatability is. Palatability is more than a matter of taste. Certainly it involves taste, but this wisdom body is more than that. It involves what we refer to as feedback, and that feedback is coming from cells and organs in response to the chemical characteristics of the foods that you're ingesting. Why do we eat food? What are we feeding? We're feeding cells ultimately, and it's the way that cells communicate with the palate to change liking for the food as a function of need. The way that we went about discovering this is as follows. We make animals mildly deficient in whatever nutrient we're interested in. Then during conditioning, on odd days in this case here, animals in group 1 were given apple-flavored food. Animals in group 2 were given maple-flavored food for a meal, much like you're enjoying right now. Straw was what we were using in the example I'll show you here. After the meal then, and we won't do this to you, we take a stomach tube, put it down your throat, pour a glass of water down there. Now that only makes sense in relation to what we do on even days. Now we switch the flavors. Animals that got apple on day 1, now they get maple. These that got maple get apple. But after you ingest the meal, we pour the nutrient you're lacking directly into your gut. Now, if the feedback from those nutrients is conditioning your liking for the food, when we give you a choice between apple and maple flavored food, if you're in group 1, which should you prefer, apple or maple? Maple, exactly. And if you're in group 2, you should prefer apple, and that's exactly what animals do, as illustrated in this video clip here that I'm going to show you. The one group, this group here, every time they ate straw, over a couple-week period, received a nutrient infusion of energy, in this case here. They were mildly deficient in energy. This group here just got water. You can see the difference in their liking for the straw. One group loves it, the other group's not interested at all. And it's all a function of feedback. They can't get enough, they can't stand it. I'll come back to this in relation to fruits and vegetables later on. Anyway, so what are calories? Calories are little units that measure how good a particular food tastes. Fudge, for example, has a great many calories, whereas celery, which is not really a food at all, but a member of the plywood family, provided by Mother Nature, it's a way to get onion dip into our mouths at parties, has none. Dave Barry has exactly the idea if you simply add the feedback term. Long story short is that feedback is so critical in terms of our liking and the other creatures' liking for food. And it's these primary compounds and this whole host of secondary compounds that I'll talk about a bit more as I go on. It's the interrelationships among those that are conditioning our liking for the flavor of food. And it's on this basis then that the wisdom of the body operates and that animals self-select foods and diets that meet their needs. It's a wisdom that's built in. But if you're with me, the thing here is that it's the pairing of the flavor with the feedback. So it's an incredibly flexible system across time and space. It's very adaptive to allow animals to regulate how much they eat and to change their liking. And then this satiety part that causes them to continually eat a variety of foods. All of those are incredibly adaptive mechanisms that allow animals to continually adapt to ever-changing environments. Now, there's some really important practical implications that have come out of this that people around the world are following up on nowadays in terms of practice. And very briefly here, Understanding palatability has enabled people to allow sheep to forage in forest plantations, in North Carolina, out in California and Washington, in vineyards. A lot's going on in California and Colorado nowadays. Citrus groves, people in Cuba are using these ideas. And what they're doing is training these sheep to avoid eating the plants they don't want them to eat based on feedback, which enables them then to forage out in those vineyards. People have also trained horses to avoid eating local weed, poisonous plants, cattle to avoid eating larkspur. At the landscape level, this has been practiced most down in Uruguay with a poisonous plant called Mio Mio at the landscape level by producers. People have also used it to train animals to eat particular foods, and this has been very important for invasive species like thistle and sericea and knapweed. There's a whole business that's sprung up out of these ideas called livestock for landscapes. On scale here in the western U.S., the last example is that we've been able to turn cattle and sheep into the low-cost alternative compared to herbicides and mechanical means to rejuvenate sagebrush steppe, largest ecosystem in North America. We're using these animals to rejuvenate those landscapes for a whole host of values. And this is being practiced now in 5 states, Oregon, Montana, Nevada, Wyoming, and Utah, with cattle and sheep both. So that's the first point then, is you've got this feedback part, this wisdom of the body. The second part of adaptation that's really critical has to do with these transgenerational links to landscapes. And what that means is what it has to do with being locally adapted to the environments where we live. Not only the animals, but the people who manage the animals. And so it's this social cultural part of adaptation that really becomes an interesting and important thing to consider. You know, it's really a way you can think of that offspring learn from their ancestors through their mothers what and what not to eat, where and where not to go, what's a predator, what's not a predator. They learn the ropes. It becomes the home field advantage for them. And certainly there are things when you look at the animals that have to do with their anatomy and physiology, how they're built and how they function, that lead to local adaptation. But it's also the behavioral knowledge, the knowledge of what's up in an environment that's so critical for survival. And it's for people as well as for the animals that we manage. And in all of that, the prior generation through mother becomes a hugely important transgenerational link. She adds stability. Her knowledge of what and what not to eat, where and where not to go becomes critical for her offspring then to figure out what and what not to do. It's so interesting to see, though, it's the young animals that typically bring the new information into the group. So many interesting examples. So we've got this wonderful balance between stability and creativity that's, again, allowing animals to continually adapt to environments. And so mother has a lifelong influence on diet selection in her offspring. And it starts in utero. Flavors in mother's amniotic fluid influence preference for foods after birth. Mother's milk, the flavors that get into milk, and then mother as a model. All those are hugely important in terms of dietary habits of offspring. The same thing's true for where animals go, where they choose to go in an environment. Cross-fostering studies with sheep, as well as 5-year study that we did with cattle on Forest Service summer range allotments, shows that mother's influence has a lifelong influence on where animals go when they become adults. They learn where to go in an environment through their interactions with mother. All this is what people refer to as predictive adaptive responses, and it simply means that they're induced by the environment early in life. They change animals. If you can relate to that, it changes you neurologically, morphologically, physiologically. Just like exercising changes muscles, these experiences change how we're built and how we function. Has huge survival advantages where when the environment where an animal's reared matches the environment where it then lives. Now, a lot of times we don't do that with livestock or with wildlife. We move them to unfamiliar places, causes problems. Long story short, Larson's got it dead on. He says, therefore, after a 40-year case study, It's my contention that couch potatoes actually begin to develop early in life as tater tots. That's it. That's the point of the whole deal if you don't follow the rest. This emerging field of epigenetics is going to put a highlight on this like no other field ever will. We've got this incredibly stable genome. How does it continually adjust? We've thought in Darwinian terms the only way it does it is through mutations and selection. What we're learning is that genes are being switched on, whole suites of genes are being switched on and off as a function of these experiences early in life. That's the key point. And if you haven't been exposed to this field, and you're interested, watch Ghost in Your Genes, this Nova special. It'll absolutely blow your mind in terms of how these genes are switching on and off to create adaptation. And that's what our program has been about, basically. And it's doing away with this age-old debate of which is more important, nature or nurture, because what you're realizing is that it's both things all the time. It's not one or the other. Genes and environments are continually dialoguing with one another. There's three implications I want to touch on related to this topic: animal adaptability, ecosystem diversity, and conservation biology. I'm going to begin with a story about animal adaptation because it's so important that you realize there's a grassroots movement that's taking place in this country and around the world. It's not huge yet, but it's so important about what people in livestock production are thinking related to adaptation. In this book, The Last Ranch, Sam Bingham wrote it. He's interviewing a guy by the name of George Wynne. George is an old-time rancher. And George is talking about the way things used to be back in the old days. And he's pointing out differences between then and now, which is a while back. But he's saying, you know, this is in the San Luis Valley of Colorado, where he was born and raised. And he's saying back in 1935, we selected for 75-pound lambs, and we culled ewes with twins. He said, now you're selecting for a 90-pound lambs and 150% lamb crop. And you would appear at the surface, this is better than this. It's more productive. But what he's pointing out are some really important points. Productivity doesn't equal profitability, because costs go up hugely with that. And he's talking about local adaptation. He's saying, our ewes were as strong and as well-muscled as deer. Yours wouldn't last a day where ours went. They didn't feed any winter forage, which is extremely costly. Their animals wintered on the floor of the San Luis Valley. Then they nomadically went up into these mountains and came back down. 2 points that are really critical to get out of this. The first is that we have come to rely on fossil fuels to make up the difference between local adaptation and production. That's how we've done that. As fossil fuel prices go up, that's going to be harder and harder to do. It's going to put the emphasis on going back to locally adapted creatures that can make a living on what nature provides in the environments where they live. Fossil fuels have made that difference. That's going to go away undoubtedly as time goes on. The second is that once you get hooked on the fossil fuel bandwagon and you learn new patterns of behavior, changing those patterns back isn't easy. And that's the point he talks about next. He said there's some people back then who wanted to try to recreate these old sheep cycles. And here's what he said about it. He said they were crazy. Said once that knowledge is gone, you can't get it back just like that. They didn't even have a dog that knew anything. When they went through here, you knew they were looking for trouble, and they found it. They didn't even get off the floor of the San Luis Valley. That is so critical to realize, this adaptation trough and the 3 to 5 years it takes when you want to change management practices to do that. This grassroots movement that's happening in this country, they call themselves herd quitters, are going back to those ways. And to read what they write, it's a study in how you go from fossil fuel dependence to off of that, and all the hurdles and hassles you face in trying to do that then, to become adapted to local environments. Here's what these people are doing, though, in terms of developing philosophies and management practices. They're matching production cycles to seasonal availability of forages. When do wildlife have their babies? Maybe that's when we should be having our calves and our lambs. rather than in the middle of winter, which is incredibly expensive, why don't we lamb and calve during the late spring and early summer? Saves $80 per cow per year just to do that. That's huge economically. And Bill, you guys did that at Deseret years ago. You're way ahead of the curve, but that is hugely, hugely important. And that may sound easy. Well, just change when you calve. It's a big, big deal. It's hard for people in so many ways. Rearing animals that can survive on what nature provides seasonally in landscapes. We've selected for huge kind of carcass animals. They're not a match in many cases. You make up the difference with fossil fuel. You get animals that are a match for your environment. Rearing offspring with their mothers where they'll be expected to produce as adults for all the reasons that I've been talking about. So to me, all of that makes sense economically as well as ecologically. It also makes sense behaviorally. If you think about it, behavior is what links ecology with economy by creating a match between animals adapted to use it and what's available in a particular environment. Second point I'd like to make related to adaptation has to do with invasive species. And obviously, nobody likes invasive species, but I want you to step back and just think about some things with me here for a second. There are over 50,000 invasive species in the United States, and the number continues to rise all the time. We spend over $120 billion a year trying to control them or trying to deal with the damages. And yet, when you look at it, as this Cornell study I'm referring to has, we have made virtually no headway. In fact, when it comes to herbicides, what we've done is to select for herbicide-resistant plants. It's Darwin 101, right? You continue to spray them. There's individuals that are adapted to that. You select for individuals that are herbicide resistant. We've got nearly 125 species in this country that are herbicide resistant. Now step back and think about what happens over a little bit longer time frame, say 15, 20,000 years, as Pelou talks about in this book here. She's talking about movements of animals and plants around the globe. And what you come to realize is these creatures are moving around all the time. They're moving all over the place. Things never were the way they were, and they never will be again, is the bottom line of all of this stuff. I like to tease my friends and say, well, you know, if we'd been here when species now were invading, what would we have done? We'd have tried to get rid of them, just like we're doing now, right? Yesterday's invasives are today's new natives and tomorrow's relics. This thing is in movement. What we need to do is not try, if we want to spend $120 billion a year, let's learn how to love them to death. Let's learn how to utilize these things. I'm serious. It's a whole philosophy and mindset that we're in. The last has to do with conservation, biology, and ecology. And the point I want to make is that oftentimes I think we view things as very static when they're probably not in terms of animals and their behaviors. And we do that oftentimes for social and political reasons related to agendas that we have. We also do it because of the way we've been trained. Most of us get trained in evolutionary biology, ecology, animal science, and we tend to view genes as something that are very set in stone. But we have to be careful on that, and it's no better illustrated than for spotted owls and in this book, In a Dark Wood. What you come to realize based on biology that's been done since the controversy over the owl is that the only owls that have to have old-growth forest are owls that are born and raised in old-growth forest for all the reasons that I'm talking about. That's where they've learned to survive. Owls can live quite nicely at the edge of old new-growth forest, and they can live even better in new-growth forest. Why? Because it's way more productive habitat. It's these experience part that we're not separating, and we're coming to think then that animals are machines, genes are destiny. But what I'm trying to get you to think about is animals are continually adapting to ever-changing environments. If you think of the average lifetime of a species, several 100,000 to a few million years, imagine the amount of change that they encounter over that lifetime. So thinking of adaptation becomes important in terms of our philosophy and also how we manage it. And it's thinking that way that's allowed us to work with wildlife populations to reduce bear depredation in forests and save Weyerhaeuser and forest industry millions of dollars every year with practices we help them develop. We worked at Deseret Land and Livestock and retrained a herd of 1,000 elk not to be fed hay all winter long. We changed the culture of the herd, saving the ranch hundreds of thousands of dollars each winter in feed bills. And we did it in ways that didn't cause depredation on all their neighbors, by the way, which is what's happening in Swan Valley now, where they simply cold turkeyed them, rather than thinking through strategically how you change the culture of a herd of animals. It's what's allowed people like Bob Budd to change the culture of cattle so that they don't live in these bottoms and degrade these wetland riparian areas. Rather, they retrained that cattle herd to use uplands. Bottom line on this, we stress genetics as the mechanism of evolution. And so when we see things, this one says earthquakes are coming, yep, the mysterious innate intuitions of some animals, huh? But what we don't realize is that there's just this tremendous amount of dialogue, epigenetic dialogue that's going on, and that these creatures are figuring out how to avoid natural selection, literally, become one of the herd, hibernate the easy way, and so forth and so on. So, last topic. So those are the first two elements of adaptation that I want to touch on. The third element has to do with what I refer to as the spice of life, and why variety and biodiversity are so absolutely critical for animals and their well-being. And it's referred to, the topic's referred to as satiety, and it comes back to these interrelationships between flavor, primary, and secondary compounds. But the bottom line is simply this. You all had a wonderful breakfast that I watched you eat, and now it was great, but what if you had to eat that again this noon? And then what if you had to eat it again tonight? And what tomorrow and the next day and the next day? It wouldn't be long, and you would be doing that, huh? Whatever you could get your mouth on that's different, you would be doing. Satiety is why the grass is always greener on the other side. It's continually challenging the body to explore the unknown. And there's nothing more important for health and nutrition than eating a variety of foods and foraging in a variety of places. It's absolutely fundamental to health and well-being. And so I want to springboard off of this as the last topic, and I want to start by saying that we like to say that nature abhors a vacuum. What nature abhors is uniformity. That's what nature abhors. When we do the studies we do, we put together as uniform a groups as we can find, and they all vary tremendously in their ability to utilize nutrients and secondary compounds. If you think about it at the general level, at the level of the population, how do you counter an ever-changing environment? You make a million creatures and you make them all different. You make every individual different. At the level of the individual, you make them so they can continually adapt. And that's what we see out of the programs that we're involved in. Now that insight, that appreciation that everybody is different leads to totally different ways to think about managing animals. And we have been able to hugely enhance nutrition and health and reduce costs by simply acknowledging that choice and ability to choose is more important than anything else for animals. You know, typically in confinement in feedlots, animals are fed one diet, what's referred to as a total mixed ration. It's all ground together. It would be like we ground your food, and that's what you get every day. You can't select what you want. If you went through a cafeteria, you'd select what works for you. We've shown that we can increase performance and reduce costs by reducing the amount of food an animal eats simply by offering them choice. We've done it with cattle, with sheep. We've done most of our work with Ted Turner's group on bison, and we've saved them hundreds of thousands of dollars every year by allowing choice and ability to choose. The same thing's true for animals on pastures and on rangelands, because choice creates opportunities for individuality. It also creates opportunities for complementarities amongst forages. That's what the people in France have come to appreciate, and probably only in France could they do it. I've just finished working on a book. We've just finished the book, Michel Murat and I, on shepherding practices in France. And a couple of the chapters in the book talk about how they move animals around landscapes within a day. And they have everything from appetizer phases to main courses to booster phases to wine and cheese, probably, could only happen in France. But think of that. Think of the applied ecology that's going on here. To look across a landscape and be able to acknowledge everything from first rate to disgusting, and then to think about how you move animals around that landscape so you utilize all that, so you create complementarities as animals go from one forage to the next to the next. That's what they do. And what they realize is that continually stimulates appetite and intake, and so performance goes up. It enables individuality. It enables each animal to select what it needs as it's moving around those landscapes. It's also maintaining the biodiversity of those landscapes because not just one subcomponent is getting beat to death. Now, we have been, over the last several years, very involved in looking at these complementarities. And probably the only group on the planet that's really looking at that. But just very briefly, a flavor of that. There's no more important plant in this United States for livestock production, for cattle production, than tall fescue. Endophyte infected tall fescue produces more cattle than any other species in the country. The interesting thing is that it's very high in alkaloids. By all rights, this is a toxic plant. And so how do people do that? Well, they plant mixtures for one thing, but what they haven't realized is that there are these complementarities that happen with these secondary compounds that can really facilitate use of the plant. And our group is just burrowing into that in a huge way. For instance, if you plant alfalfa that's high in saponins, and you have to seek out those varieties, or plants like trefoil that are very high in tannins, what we're showing is that the saponins and the tannins bind up these alkaloids. They bind them in the gut so that they no longer harm the animal. They're passed through. It's a complementarity that comes from having diversity and having the right mixes of diversity. We're working in Hawaii right now with a hugely invasive species called fireweed that's causing big problems in cattle there. It does liver damage. Animals are declared unfit as a result of that. And what we're showing is that tannins in forages there bind up these pyrrolizidine alkaloids in firewood. So what we're talking about here is planting mixtures of plants that have complementarities in them and thinking about biodiversity in that sense because it facilitates nutrition and health. Now, I want to step back and just say a couple of words about these secondary compounds. I've just been very quickly going through them. They've been studied tremendously over the last 30 years in the ecological literature. And what we've come to realize is that they set a limit on how much of any one food an animal can eat. That's one of the things they do. It's a benefit to plants because plants don't get overutilized, so they set a limit. And that's been shown in marine systems with fishes, in terrestrial systems with insects, birds, and with mammals. Now, as a result of that work, though, and similar work in agronomy and animal science, people have come to view these secondary compounds in a negative light. They're defenses or they're toxins. Our work nowadays is trying to say, whoa, wait a minute. In monoculture, that's true. In too high dosages, that's true. But if you back them off, if you get them in mixture, and if you get them in lower concentrations, they probably have huge, huge benefits to animals. That's the theme I want to finish on here. From a plant standpoint, over the last 30 or 40 years, people who study plants have come to realize that these secondary compounds aren't secondary at all. They're absolutely vitally important in the health and well-being of the plants themselves. They serve everything as sunscreen to enhancing drought resistance, to hormonal signaling, recovery from injury, protection from overgrazing, attractants to pollinators, on and on and on and on. They serve multiple values. Here's the irony. Here's the interesting part. What we've done in agronomy and in crop production is to select against secondary compounds. We've identified what the compounds are that decrease palatability of plants, and we select against those to maximize yields of crops and pastures that are inevitably more susceptible, though, to environmental hardship. So that requires more inputs. In their stead, we've come to rely on fertilizers, herbicides, and insecticides to grow and protect plants in monoculture. We've come to rely on antibiotics and antiemetics to maintain the health of livestock rather than letting these compounds do it. For people, we've replaced whole foods with diverse secondary compounds with nutrition supplements and pharmaceuticals. There's costs to all of that. There's huge costs. In terms of food production, back in 1940, it took 2.3 calories of food energy to produce 1 calorie of, we produce 2.3 calories of food energy for every 1 calorie of fossil fuel that we used. Now it takes 1 calorie, we produce 1 calorie of fossil food energy for each, you get what I'm trying to say, for each 10 calories of fossil fuel energy. We've hugely ramped up the fossil fuel inputs, right? Well, we were ramping down the ways that plants normally did that. There's costs in terms of the modern diet. Spending on health care has gone from 5% in 1960 to 16% nowadays. And that's all related, diet-related diseases, cancer, diabetes, stroke, heart disease. Now, people acknowledge that. They know that that's happening. But trying to change the modern diet, that's a whole other deal, right? Despite concerted efforts, adults and children are not complying. They're not utilizing fruits and vegetables and whole grains and all of these sorts of things. Now, there are political, there are corporate, and there are social reasons that that system is so rigidly locked into place. But that's all learned kind of stuff, and it can be changed. Now, from the social standpoint, one of the more interesting ones, my good friend Julie Manella, who works at the Manella Institute of Chemical Senses, is preeminent in her field in this. She's studied the same sort of things I was talking to you about that we've studied in livestock and humans. And she shows that mother's diet hugely influences the food preferences of our offspring. It starts in utero, mother's milk's important, and mother is a model. That's the way you've got to start to break out of this vicious cycle we're in of very poor diets, of increased spending on health care, ultimately increased spending on what we do. So all of these then are unanticipated and probably mostly unintended kind of consequences of what we've been doing. What I'm trying to get you to think about is that biodiverse plant communities, whether that's gardens or croplands or pastures or rangelands, can be viewed literally as nutrition centers and pharmaceuticals that can enhance the health and well-being of the soil, of the plants, of the animals, and ultimately of the people who live on those. That's health. That's health in the broadest sense. That's what we need to be thinking about. And we're starting to think about that a little bit. We're starting from the human standpoint to recognize that all these big named kind of compounds that occur in fruits and vegetables play important roles in our health. But that still isn't an integral part of the way people in medicine or in nutrition think about things. It needs to be, because that's what health ultimately gets back to. Cindy Engel is trying to get people, even less so do we think about it as relates to wild and domestic animals. But Cindy's trying to get people to think about it in writing books like this, Wild Health, How Animals Keep Themselves Well and What We Can Learn From Them. How do animals deal with the hardships of their day-to-day existence, huh? I took that picture down here last night, so I don't know what all goes on. I thought it was a better place than that, but anyway. Here's some chapters in the book. Nature's Pharmacy, Food Medicine, Self-Medication. She reviews work that we've done on our project. That's the base work we've done is the basis for those first 2 chapters of her book. She goes right on down to Getting High, Psychological Ills, Family Planning, and Facing the Inevitable. Book gets a little bit more speculative as she goes in. But what she's doing is saying, you know, here's roles these compounds play for wild animals, and that we ought to be thinking about that in terms of what we do as peoples for ourselves and for the animals that we work with. Let me just give you one brief example from a livestock standpoint, or it would be for a wild animal as well. Take compounds like tannins that occur in plants like this bird's foot trefoil. You know, they're very important nutritionally. They enhance nutrition. Without going into details, those compounds in a diet can enhance nutrition of animals. They're important in health. They help, it's so interesting, they reduce internal parasite loads. And when they're planted in combination with plants like alfalfa, they alleviate bloat. Methane. When animals have tannin in their diet, the amount of methane they produce is greatly reduced when ruminants have that. Compounds like tannins and lignans help to build soil organic matter and to fix carbon in the soil, which again ties back with this whole issue of global warming. The secondary compounds aren't secondary at all, is the point. They are primary in terms of the health of systems, and yet if anything, we've not only ignored them, but we've tried to get rid of them by going to monoculture. Our goal on our project, our whole thing, is to try to create landscapes that promote healthy soil, plants, herbivores, and people, and to move away from pills and procedures that treat symptoms of ill health and well-being that don't have to do fundamentally with what health is. Over 60 years ago, André Voisin wrote this book, Soil, Grass, and Cancer. In that book, he argued that our health is ultimately tied to the health of the soil. It's amazing when you start to realize that. And it doesn't matter whether you're a farmer who works with it every day or a broker on Wall Street. Ultimately, we all exist or don't based on the health of the systems that support us. And soil is fundamental. I've been reading this book recently. An undergrad gave it to me who's going into medicine. And she is wanting to be a part of our program related to health in this sense that I've been discussing it all morning here. Ecological Medicine, it's titled, and it's got some real heavyweights in it. People like Andrew Weil are writing these short little synthesis chapters. It's a marvelous book. They're talking about health. You know, the Western way of looking at health has some benefits for certain. They're not saying to get rid of that, but they're saying we have got to broaden our view of what health is. Health is way more than what we've done here in this country. And you start to appreciate it's echoing, and it's so much in the flavor of what I'm talking about here, even though they don't relate so much to these linkages I've been discussing. That's the flavor of this book, Healing the Earth, Healing Ourselves. So let me just end on this note of these two related to diet and livestock. Going back to Andrew's work, you know, there's review papers that are being published nowadays. One just came out that's talking about today's produce, fruits and vegetables. Nutrient content has declined in 43 fruits and vegetables from 1950 to 1999. They look great. They taste like you know what. They don't have any flavor at all in them. Why? Why is that happening? It's the soils we grow them on. The soils are absolutely depauperate in terms of organic matter, nutrients. We simply add the fertilizers, add the insecticides. They're not being grown on healthy soil. The soil is part. The other is the varieties that we've selected for. The produce is designed for yield and shipping, not for nutrition and flavor. It doesn't have this rich blend of these primary and secondary compounds. So it's no wonder kids don't like fruits and vegetables. Nobody does, you know. They're not like what you would rear. Rear stuff on really healthy soil and good varieties, you love it because it's so good for your body, and your body's telling you that through the feedback. Last point here has to do with these guys here. And Kathleen and I were talking, you know, a lot of times people say, well, livestock are the worst thing for a landscape. It's all how we manage them. It's all how we manage them. And there are some movements that are taking place, I've got to tell you, that are absolutely fantastic, where you use high stock densities for short periods to rejuvenate landscapes. Animals are one of the most powerful rejuvenators there's ever been for a landscape. By their foraging, their trampling, their urine and fecal inputs. What they do, the animals themselves change the soils. They can build up the structure of soils, which changes then the resource that's available. If you build more organic matter into soil, you have better water holding capacity. You get more fertility. That changes plant diversity and chemistry. That feeds back then to benefit the herbivores themselves in terms of their nutrition and health. But it goes well beyond that, huh, Silvana? It starts to feed up. If they're eating healthy diets, diverse mixes of different plant species, that changes not only the flavor, but the nutritional characteristics of their milk, meat, and cheese for human consumption. For instance, animals that have tannin in their diet, meat that has higher antioxidant capacity. Saponins, there's reason to believe that saponins, we know saponins in the diet bind cholesterol. If have saponins, they bind cholesterol in our gut. We're We're looking now, and part of one of our research projects, when animals have saponins in their diet, does that help to have meat and cheese with saponins in it? And what does that do in terms of cholesterol? It scales up even more than that, though. You know, of the two ways that you can sequester carbon, power stations with CO2 capture or terrestrial sequestration, this is one of the best ways. It's one of the most efficient ways you can do it. My good friend Kathleen Jones, who has spent her entire life as a soil scientist studying these things and is now Miss Carbon Fixation for Australia, has done the math. And what she points out is that for every ton of humus you can fix in soil, you pull 3.67 tons of carbon out of the atmosphere. What does that mean for Australia? If you increase by 0.5% the organic matter in those soils, on 2% of that landscape, Australia is carbon neutral. These guys are the way to start to change what's happening on a global basis. And it's those links, it's those linkages is what I'm trying to get you to think about. We are linked from cells and organs through landscapes, and behavior is what's linking us to these landscapes across time and space. And it's people who are interested in those landscapes who have been a part of what this group that we call Behave. And Bill and Kathleen and many people have been a part of that. What's Behave about? Behave is about innovation. That's absolutely what we're about. Bringing together the most innovative people in science with the most innovative people in practice to feed off of one another, to continually push the bounds of what's known, to move us into the unknown, to continually create the future, and out of that to create new practices. Everybody sees the world in a little bit different way as a result of the way that we've been trained and the way that we come to focus. I've come to believe that in the end it's just one thing, and everybody sees a true facet of that thing, but we all see just a tiny part of it. And it's so big and complex, we can forever continue to create our way into the future. And so what everybody says is absolutely impossible, from this viewpoint it probably is. But when you get very creative people all interacting, the sky is the limit. It's limitless, but it requires tremendous amount of thought and creativity. That's what Behave is about in my mind. And we have a long timeline, starting back from '69 is really kind of the origins, and there's landmarks all along the way. But bottom line is, over this last 30 years, we've trained over 50 graduate students. We've collaborated with over 30 visiting scientists. We've written over 250 peer-reviewed papers by now. Stan, we cranked out a few last night. And we've presented over 400 talks and workshops. That 400 talks and workshops is in the last 10 years. Globally, the demand is huge in interest in this topic. We've come up with over 100 original findings about these processes of food and habitat selection, as well as processes related to human behavior and adaptation. So the people trained by Behave and the science management concepts are now being implemented around the world. But Behave is at a branching point. Nothing stays the same. For Behave to grow and develop and continue to evolve, we're going to have to ramp it up to a whole other scale. That's the key point that I'm getting at here. And it's got to be, in my mind, about linkages, linking our health with the health of soil, plant, people, animal, and people. And that health means including holistic veterinary practices, holistic practices in medicine. It's not just about agriculture, it's about systems, entire systems, and our health, and what it means for that to be health. So what we're trying to do is think about a model. What's a model to try to continue this, to continue to develop the principles and practices, and to deal with the ever-increasing demand? How can we globalize that? And maybe not in a bricks and mortars kind of structure, but in more of a, if you've read Starfish and the Spiders, kind of, this really organic, growing, living kind of model. And so if any of this resonates with you, if any of you business minds out there are interested in trying to help us ramp up, I would be hugely interested in visiting with you. And with that, I don't know if I made my half hour, I probably didn't, but I hugely appreciate the opportunity to be here with you. And that is it. if there is time for questions, I'd be happy to take any that you have.
But you referenced the so-called invasive species and mentioned there might be ways to embrace or reduce those species. Do you have an example or two you could share?
Yes, all of the work that we're doing nowadays with at that very first part where we're either using through the combination of different animal species, sheep, goats, cattle, or training animals to utilize those, or creating complementarities. We're doing work all over the country and in different parts of the world where we're really enhancing use of all kinds of invasive species. All kinds. I can get down to specifics of from thistles to sericias to you name it. I can give you many more specifics. We're doing it. Yeah, not just talking about it, we're doing it right now. Including sagebrush steppe. Most people say cattle and sheep can't utilize sagebrush. We're showing that if you do it from the right way, not only can you do that, you can create animals that'll utilize that stuff really well. So that's going into practice. That's in practice, yep. Yes, you bet. Lucy.
Is there a web page with some more of this information on behave and perhaps a list of the references that were in your talk so that some of us who can't remember from one minute to the next can go?
There sure is. Yeah, there sure is. Beth Burritt, you remember Beth?
Yes.
Lucy and I worked in the lab together back when we looked a lot different than we do right now. Anyway, a lot of fun memories actually. It's been a long time. But behave. Just look up behave on the webs, behave on the internet, and Beth's been doing a fantastic job of pulling together tons of information on that. Yeah, you bet.
Listen, I'd like to thank Fred for this talk and thank all of you for being here. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you bet. Thank you.